ease into the quiet. Let your shoulders soften and let the night take the weight from you. Just for tonight, we'll drift across still waters to the Irish land where no one grows old. If you drift off easily here, subscribe. A new one arrives every night. Tir na nOg, 3 syllables spoken slowly in the dark, the mouth moving through them the way the mouth moves through something old and worth taking time with. The first word tir begins at the front of the mouth and opens, a short, clean vowel, land, ground, a place where a foot can rest. The second, na, is the lightest thing in the phrase, a small grammatical hinge, a genitive article doing its quiet work of connection. And the third, nog, and here the voice rounds, here the long vowel opens wide, ug, young, youth, the quality of being at the beginning rather than the end of something, spoken in a language already ancient when the first written versions of these stories were being set down on vellum in the monasteries of early medieval Ireland. Tir na nOg, the land of the young. The name is Old Irish, and it is precise. Tir means land, not merely as territory, but as ground, as the thing beneath the feet that makes a place real and particular and different from the water or the sky. Na is the genitive article in its plural form, the connecting word that makes the following noun possessive. And og means young in the full sense of the word, not merely new, not merely recent, but young in the way a living thing at the height of its vitality is young, vigorous, and undiminished, and entirely itself. Together, the 3 words make a compound that functions both as geography and as promise, a land that belongs to youth, a land where youth is not something that passes, but something the land itself maintains, the way a particular valley maintains its particular quality of light. The pronunciation in modern Irish sits close to the older form, Tir na nOg, the sounds softened by centuries of a living language moving through living mouths. But the words themselves have not changed their meaning. Whatever else has shifted in the long passage from oral tradition to manuscript to modern reconstruction, the name has remained stable, a small, exact description of the place, told in the same words, across a very long time. The word og carries something inside it that is worth dwelling on for a moment. In Old Irish literary culture, youth was understood not simply as the condition of being early in life, but as a quality of wholeness and unreduced power that could, in certain places or under certain conditions, be sustained indefinitely. The otherworld traditions of Ireland return to this quality again and again. The inhabitants of Tir na nOg do not merely happen to be young. They are young because the place itself prevents the diminishment that mortal life eventually performs on every living body. The land and the condition named after it are not separate things. They are the same thing. The word og, that single long-voweled syllable, is carrying all of that when it is spoken. Scholars who have worked closely with the old Irish mythological texts, among them Proincius MacConach, who spent decades mapping the structures of Celtic mythology, and John Carey, whose careful attention to the manuscript traditions of early medieval Ireland has done much to clarify what the sources actually say, have placed Tir na nOg within a broader tradition of Irish otherworld geography. It is not the only named paradise in that tradition. It is one of several, but within that tradition, it occupies a specific and recognizable position, and the features that define it are consistent across a wide range of sources, from the earliest surviving manuscript texts to the oral traditions collected by scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries. What makes Tir na nOg distinct, even within a tradition already rich in otherworld geographies, is precisely the thing its name announces. Not simply beauty, not simply abundance, not simply the suspension of ordinary difficulty, but the permanent and complete absence of aging, death, and physical decay, actively replaced by their opposites, so that life in the land of the young is not merely comfortable or pleasurable, but permanently undiminished. That quality distinguishes it from the realm of the dead, as understood in Christian or classical Greek terms. This is not a place where the dead go. This is a place where no one dies, which is a different thing entirely. The manuscripts that preserve these traditions are by now very old. The major collections of Irish mythological narrative were set down in the 11th and 12th centuries. Though the material they preserve is often considerably older, the residue of oral traditions moving through generations before anyone thought or was permitted to write them down. The Book of the Dun Cow, compiled around the year 1100 in the monastery of Clonmacnoise. The Book of Leinster, compiled sometime in the 12th century. Manuscripts written by monks in stone buildings on the western edge of Europe, setting down with careful, practiced hands the stories of gods and heroes and otherworld kingdoms that their pre-Christian ancestors had told around fires in a world without writing. The vellum of those manuscripts has yellowed, the ink has settled into the grain of the skin, the hands that held the quill are gone, and inside those pages, described in letters small and even and densely packed, there is a land where no one grows old. The location of Tir na nOg across all these sources is consistently westward. To the west, beyond the visible horizon of the Atlantic Ocean, in a direction the Irish associated with the setting sun, and with the particular kind of transformation that the setting sun performs each evening, the passage from light into something that is not darkness exactly, but is the other side of the day, the place the light goes when it is done. The Irish west coast faces out across the widest stretch of ocean in the North Atlantic. There is no land between the western coast of Ireland and the American continent, and for the people of early medieval Ireland, there was simply no land at all between the western shore and the edge of what could be known. The horizon was the boundary, and beyond the boundary, in the geographic imagination of the tradition, lay the other world. This western orientation is not unique to Tir na nOg. It belongs to the broader cosmological structure of the Irish otherworld tradition, in which the West functions as a directional category, carrying multiple kinds of meaning simultaneously. The setting sun moved westward. The dead were understood, in pre-Christian belief, to travel westward. The otherworld was consistently located in that same direction, a single compass point, carrying layered associations, transformation, passage, the completion of the day, the beginning of what comes after. That layering is not contradictory. It reflects a coherent spatial imagination in which one direction holds multiple related meanings, all of them organized around the concept of a threshold between what is ordinarily known and what lies beyond the reach of ordinary knowing. Weizi? These associations are worth sitting with without any particular weight of grief or finality attached to them. The westward direction in the Irish tradition is cosmologically rich rather than emotionally dark. It is the direction of the sun's daily completion, of a passage that the sun itself makes successfully every evening and which results the next morning in exactly what it resulted in the morning before. The threshold the Irish imagined to the west was not a terminal point, but a permeable edge, a place that could be reached and crossed, and in the best of the stories, returned from, though, as the tradition makes clear, the crossing changes things, and what is carried back is not always the same as what was carried forward. The otherworld geography of early medieval Irish literature contains several distinct named realms, and scholars have debated at considerable length whether these represent genuinely different places within a shared mythological cosmology, or whether they are regional and temporal variants for a single, conceived otherworld that different traditions and different storytellers called by different names. Mag Mel, the plane of delight, or in some translations, the plane of joy, or the honey plane, appears in texts associated with the mythological cycles as a place of supernatural abundance and pleasure, associated primarily with the sea and with the supernatural beings. The Irish tradition calls the Tuatha De Danann the divine people who were understood to have inhabited Ireland before the Gaelic ancestors arrived. Tir Tairngire, the land of promise, or the promised land, a phrase that acquired a second layer of meaning when Christian scribes began working with this material, appears in other sources, sometimes as a place located across the sea, and sometimes as a place beneath the surface of the world. Tir Fothuin, the land under the wave, describes an otherworld that lies beneath the ocean itself rather than beyond it, the sea functioning as the ceiling of a kingdom that exists in a different kind of space from the world above. These distinctions may be genuine, different traditions with different imagined geographies, preserved in different manuscript traditions, reflecting different regional understandings of what the otherworld was like and where it was located, or the differences may be largely nominal, the same place, understood as the same kind of place, given different names by different storytellers in different centuries for reasons of emphasis or local tradition, or simply the ordinary variation that living oral cultures generate. The scholarly debate on this question has not reached a settled conclusion, and there is something in the uncertainty itself that is interesting. The Irish mythological tradition was not a single unified system produced all at once. It was a vast accumulation of stories and beliefs and images developed across many centuries by many people in many places, and the rich proliferation of otherworld names may simply reflect the fact that a tradition this extensive naturally generates more than one way of talking about the same magnificent idea. What all these named places share, and what connects them to Tir na nOg in particular, is the quality of being genuinely other, not a version of the mortal world with the difficult parts removed, but a different order of existence entirely, operating by different rules, maintaining different conditions, existing in a different relationship to time. This is not fantasy in the modern sense of a made-up world that operates like the real world with the addition of magic. The Irish otherworld traditions describe a place that the tradition treats as real as any geographic location, as real as the particular fields and hills and coastlines of Ireland itself, but real in a way that does not need to submit to the same conditions that govern mortal life. The otherworld is not better than the mortal world in the sense of being the mortal world optimized. It is different in kind. Tir na nOg is the most precisely named of these places. The name does not describe the landscape or the emotional quality or the political structure of the realm. It describes the single most fundamental fact about what life inside it is like, the land of the young. The name is a definition. Whatever else might vary between one account and another, the architecture, the rulers, the activities of the inhabitants, the particular features of the landscape, the defining fact named in the title remains constant across every version. No one who lives there grows old. The manuscript traditions that preserve the fullest surviving descriptions of Tir na nOg include the Lawi Oisín ar Tir na nOg, the lament or lay of Oisín in the Land of Youth, a poem of considerable length composed in the 18th century by the County Clare poet Michal Coimín, drawing on much older oral and manuscript traditions. Oisín's poem is the primary source for the most elaborate surviving description of what Tir na nOg looks like and what happens inside it, but the traditions it draws on reach back much further through oral storytelling traditions that were already ancient when Oisín was working, through manuscript fragments in the great medieval codices, and through the extensive body of early Irish mythological narrative in which the concept of the otherworld as a western sea paradise was already fully formed. A manuscript page from one of the great medieval Irish codices, the Book of Leinster, for instance, or the Yellow Book of Lacan, is a particular kind of object. The vellum is made from animal skin, prepared by scraping and stretching until it is thin enough to receive ink. The hand that wrote on it moved steadily and with practiced efficiency, fitting as much text as possible into the available space, the letters small and even, the lines dense and close together. These were not decorative objects in the manner of the Book of Kells. They were practical repositories, collections of material that someone thought was worth preserving, set down in writing against the possibility that the oral tradition carrying it might not survive. In many cases, the people who made these manuscripts did not know exactly how old the material they were preserving was. They were writing down traditions that had already been moving through time for centuries. They were making a permanent record of something that had previously existed only in the mouths and memories of people who might at any point fail to pass it on. What they wrote down, among many other things, was a set of descriptions of a land to the west of Ireland where no one ages and no one dies, a land of white stone palaces and flowering hills and rivers of honey and music of impossible beauty, a land governed by a king connected to the sea and to the supernatural, with a daughter of golden hair who might ride eastward across the water when she had reason to, a land that operated outside the rules of mortal time, so that 100 years there might feel like a short season, and a man who returned from it after what seemed like months might find that the country he had left had aged by centuries. These descriptions were set down in monasteries by Christian monks preserving material that belonged to a religious and cosmological tradition very different from their own. That is itself a remarkable fact. The monks who wrote this material down were not recording their own beliefs. They were preserving a tradition that preceded them, treating it as worth keeping even in a cultural context that might have found reasons to discard it. Whatever combination of scholarly instinct and cultural loyalty and simple respect for the past motivated those monks, the result is that the Irish mythological tradition survives in extraordinary richness compared to many other European traditions, and the descriptions of Tir na nOg survive within it in enough detail to make the place genuinely imaginable. The geographic imagination that produced Tir na nOg was working from a very specific landscape. The west coast of Ireland is not a gentle coast. It is a coast of headlands and cliffs and long estuarial bays, of islands scattered across the nearshore water like stones dropped from a height, of mountains whose western faces catch the Atlantic weather directly and without shelter. The Aran Islands sit at the mouth of Galway Bay, low and flat and windswept, their limestone pavement running to the cliff edge. The cliffs of Moher rise 214 meters from the Atlantic in County Clare. The Dingle Peninsula in Kerry extends westward into the ocean for 30 miles, its tip at Slee Head, the westernmost point of mainland Ireland. On a clear evening, on any of these headlands or cliff edges or western-facing shores, the Atlantic horizon is a long, unbroken horizontal line where the gray-green water meets the sky. The sun goes down behind it, and somewhere past it, in the geographic imagination of the people who lived on those coasts for thousands of years, in a direction that was also the direction of the gods and the dead and the transformations of the world. There was a land that does not appear on any map. That quality, the land that does not appear on any map, the land that is real in the tradition without being locatable by navigation, is not a flaw in the mythology. It is precisely the kind of reality the otherworld is. The Irish mythological sources do not position Tir na nOg as a place that could theoretically be found if a ship sailed far enough west. The location is consistent and specific, westward, across the ocean, but the distance is not measurable in ordinary terms, because the otherworld does not occupy the same kind of space as the places that can be measured and mapped. It is in the west in the same way that transformation is associated with the west, not as a literally navigable coordinate, but as a direction that carries meaning, that points towards something that ordinary instruments are not equipped to find. The tradition does, however, describe people reaching it. The journey is possible. It requires, in the most famous versions of the story, a supernatural guide and a supernatural horse, and the crossing feels particular and real. The spray of the water, the sound of the waves, the Irish coastline diminishing behind. The experience of crossing has a texture that the tradition renders carefully. This is not a place reached by dying or by dreaming. It is a place reached by traveling, and the travel itself is part of what the stories describe. The otherworld is somewhere. The question is only how to get there. The western shore of Ireland, at evening, has a particular quality of light. In the late afternoon, the sun moves across the sky in a low arc and falls toward the horizon at an angle that fills the western sky with an extended, gradual, unhurried transition through gold and amber, and finally a gray-silver that settles over the water after the sun has gone. Clouds over the Atlantic catch this light and hold it longer than it lasts on land. The water reflects it at an angle so that the sea in the last hour of daylight looks illuminated from below as well as above, a flat brightness lying under the wave surfaces. The horizon where the water meets the sky is sharp and clear weather, a precise edge, a clean division, the visible limit of what can be seen from where a person is standing. That horizon is where the tradition located Tir na nOg, not beyond it in the sense of being obscured or hidden, but beyond it in the sense of being past the limit of ordinary vision, past the edge of the mapped world, in the space that the eyes cannot reach but the imagination can. The earliest Irish storytellers who told these stories lived on a coast that faced that horizon every evening. They had the specific experience of watching the sun complete its daily passage into the west and disappear. They had the specific experience of standing at the edge of the known world and looking outward into a width of water that had no visible far shore. What they imagined beyond that edge was not emptiness. It was not nothing. It was a land of white hills and blossoming trees and rivers of honey, where no one aged and no one died, and the music was of a quality that mortal harpers could only approach and never reach. They imagined it with enough detail that it felt like a place a person could stand in and breathe, a place with a sky of its own and a particular quality of light, and hills that had the specific shape of hills in a real landscape. They gave it a name precise enough to function as a description, and they told its stories for long enough that some of those stories survived into manuscript form in the monasteries of the 11th and 12th centuries, and from there into the collections and retellings and oral traditions of later centuries, and from there into the present where the name is still spoken, Tir na nOg, by a living language that still knows what it means. The word Tir itself, land, country, ground, is worth returning to for a moment. It is a word that describes something you can stand on, something solid and specific with its own geography, its own weather, its own particular relationship between hills and water and sky. In Old Irish, the word tír carried both a geographic and a metaphysical weight simultaneously, because in the Irish mythological tradition, the distinction between geography and metaphysics was not always a distinction the tradition drew. The otherworld was not a concept, or an idea or a symbol. It was a place, a real place, with shores and distances and an interior that could be traveled through. Tír nOg is not a state of mind or a spiritual condition or an allegory for something else, though it has been read as all of those things by later interpreters. In its own terms, in the terms of the tradition that produced it, it is a land, tír, a place with the specific concreteness that word implies. That concreteness matters for understanding why these stories have the quality they have. The Irish otherworld traditions are not dream literature in the sense of being vague or impressionistic or loosely organized. They are precise. The palaces have measurable halls. The rivers have specific qualities. The inhabitants have names and relationships and histories. Tír nOg is described as a place someone went to and lived in, not as a place someone glimpsed or dreamed of. The texture of the description is the texture of a real geography, rendered in the elevated and beautiful register of mythological poetry, yes, but grounded in the same kind of careful specificity that a person would use to describe a place they had actually been. This quality of grounded specificity is part of what makes the tradition worth spending time with. These stories were told by people who believed in the reality of what they were describing, not necessarily as literal geography, but as genuine otherworld knowledge, as accurate descriptions of a place that existed in the full cosmological sense, even if it could not be found by ordinary navigation. The difference between believing something is literally true and believing it is genuinely real is a distinction the Irish mythological tradition seems to have held with considerable sophistication. The monks who preserved these stories in manuscripts did so in a cultural context that had its own very different account of the other world, and yet they preserved the older traditions carefully, as something worth keeping, as genuine knowledge of a kind, even if not the same kind as Christian theology. A medieval Irish monk, copying descriptions of Tír nOg onto vellum in a monastery in the west of Ireland, was working within earshot of the same Atlantic that those descriptions pointed toward. On a clear day from the monastery window, if the building faced west, the horizon would have been visible, the same flat, gray-silver line, the same absolute edge of the visible world, the same direction. The monk and the storyteller who came before him shared a landscape, and that shared landscape was part of the context in which these stories made the particular kind of sense they made. What the tradition described was always somewhere specific, even if unreachable by ordinary means, to the west past the horizon, in the direction the sun goes when the day is done. The oldest Irish accounts do not hedge this location or qualify it. They state it as the kind of fact that does not require argument, because everyone already knows it. If there is an other world, and there is, it is to the west, past the Atlantic, past the visible edge of things, in a direction that the people of the Irish coast faced every evening when the light began to change. The western shore of Ireland in the last hour of daylight, a long headland dropping into gray-green water, the surface of the sea catching the last of the light in flat, bright sheets, the horizon absolutely clear, the line between water and sky as precise as a word spoken aloud, the light behind the horizon fading slowly, not all at once, the sky going through its gradual transformations, gold fading to amber, amber softening to a gray, so pale it is nearly silver, the water below going darker as the sky above goes pale, until the surface of the ocean and the sky above it are the same soft, undifferentiated tone, and the horizon between them is no longer a contrast, but a continuous expanse. Beyond that horizon, in the imagination of the earliest Irish storytellers, something was there, something specific and real in the terms the tradition used for real. A land with hills and rivers and white stone buildings, a land where the trees blossomed and did not shed their blossom, a land where the music played in halls full of people who had been there for centuries and who showed no sign of the centuries on their faces or their hands, a land where the same morning light returned each day, and the afternoon was always the same unhurried afternoon, and the distance between a person and the horizon was always exactly as it had always been. The horizon is wide and unbroken. The water is quiet in the last of the evening light. Whatever the earliest Irish storytellers imagined lying beyond the visible edge of the Atlantic, in the direction the sun completed its daily passage, in the direction both the living and the transformed were understood to travel, in the direction that the tradition had decided, for reasons that were already ancient when the manuscripts were made, belonged to the otherworld. They imagined it with enough care and enough precision and enough genuine belief in its reality that the name they gave it has survived 1,000 years of telling and is still in the language they spoke, completely legible. Tir nOg, the land of the young, the place past the horizon where no one grows old, somewhere out there in the direction the light goes, on the slopes of Ben Bulben, in the long light of an Irish afternoon, Fionn McCumhall stood and looked at a child standing among deer. The child was very still. That was the first thing, the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a frightened human child, but something else entirely, something that belonged to the animals around him. The deer moved slowly through the rough grass of the hillside, their heads dropping and lifting, their ears turning, their dark eyes moving without urgency over the slope and the sky. And among them, at the same unhurried pace, the child moved too, or stood without moving, as if the distinctions that separated a person from an animal were for him genuinely less fixed than they were for anyone watching from a distance. Fionn McCumhall, who had hunted these slopes for years, and who knew what wild things looked like when they were calm, and what they looked like when they were not, understood in that moment that this child had not come here. This was where the child lived. Ben Bulben rises from the plain of County Sligo in the northwest of Ireland, its limestone plateau cutting a flat, clean line against whatever sky is above it, gray more often than not, or the particular pale blue of an Irish autumn afternoon, or white with low cloud moving in from the Atlantic. The mountain sides are steep and heathered, dropping sharply from the plateau edge to the valley floor. From the valley, looking up, the plateau appears almost architectural, a long level surface held at a height that seems deliberate, as though the mountain had been designed to present its top as a threshold. Below it, the land spreads green and wide, the fields running down to the coast. In the mythology of the Irish tradition, Ben Bulben was already a place where the ordinary and the otherworldly were understood to have had dealings with each other. This was not the only story set on these slopes, but it was the one that gave the mountain something it had not previously had, a name embedded in a name, a deer's identity folded inside a human one, a child who was both things at once. The story of how that child came to be among the deer begins with his mother, Sadba, whose name is pronounced approximately Siva, the syllable long and open, a sound that moves without resistance through the mouth. Sadba was a woman of otherworld origin, connected to the world that lay beyond ordinary sight and ordinary time, and she had been transformed by a druid whose name in Irish was Fear Dorich, meaning the Dark Man, a figure whose presence in the story carries weight enough to explain everything and requires very little elaboration, into a deer. The transformation was done as an act of compulsion, because Sadbu had refused what was demanded of her. In the form of a deer, she lived in the wilderness of Connaught and Leinster until she came to the hill of Allen in County Kildare, where Fionn and the Fionn made their home, and where inside the protective boundary of that place, the druid's power did not reach her, and she was able to return to her human form. She and Fionn were together for a time at the Hill of Allen, in a period described in the tradition as one of great happiness. Then Fionn went out on a campaign, and in his absence, a figure appeared at the hill wearing the appearance of Fionn himself, and Sadba, deceived by the likeness, went with it, and was taken back into the wilderness, and transformed again, and was not seen in human form again. That grief, Fionn's return to find her gone, his years of searching, is held in the tradition quietly, as a fact about him that shaped everything afterward. It is not dwelt on here. What matters for the story is what came of it, the child. When Fionn's hounds found the boy on the slopes of Ben Bulben, running with the deer, he was perhaps 7 years old. The details vary in different accounts. Some say the hounds circled him and then lay down, which would mean something, because those hounds, Bran and Skeolan, were themselves of otherworld descent and would have recognized a kindred quality in the child. Others describe the boy as simply walking among the animals, unafraid, unharmed, belonging to the herd in some way that the deer also appeared to accept as natural. Fionn came forward, and the child stood still and looked at him, and Fionn, who had loved Sadb and who had searched for her for years across the west of Ireland, looked at this child with his deer-herd calm and his otherworld-touched eyes, and knew him. The name Fionn gave the boy was Oisín. In the older Irish it is written Oisín, its 2 syllables running together in the mouth, Oisín, the first syllable open and round, the second falling away almost before it arrives. The name comes directly from the Old Irish word os, which means deer, with the diminutive suffix -in attached to it, the same suffix that creates small and affectionate forms of many Irish words. Oisín means as directly as a name can mean anything, little deer, or fawn. It is a name that describes what Fionn saw when he looked at his son, not a metaphor, not a poetic choice made at a distance, but the literal physical fact of what the child was in the moment of his discovery. A small deer, a fawn, standing in the grass among the real deer, who was also a boy, who was also, it turned out, the son of the greatest warrior in Ireland. The name carries something else inside it too. In the Celtic traditions of Ireland and the island to its east, and the continental land further east again, the deer is not simply an animal that people hunted, though it was that. It was understood as a creature that moved along the edges of things, the edge of the forest, the edge of the light, the edge between the inhabited world and the wilderness beyond it. The deer was a threshold creature, and that quality of standing at the place where 2 different kinds of world met, with one foreleg lifted, and its attention equally divided between what was behind it and what was ahead, was not incidental. It was structural. It was what the deer was in the imagination of the tradition. And so a child named Oisín was not simply a child who had been found among deer. He was a child whose name announced, quietly and precisely, that his nature was to occupy the threshold between worlds, that he was positioned by parentage and by name and by the circumstances of his early life, at the place where the ordinary met the extraordinary and belonged equally to both. What Fionn did with this child was straightforward in the way that necessary things tend to be straightforward. He brought him home. He recognized him as his son, which in the tradition is a recognition that carries real weight. Fionn acknowledging the child publicly before the Fianna as the son of Sodhav and his own heir within the warrior community. The Fianna received Oisín as one of their own, which is to say, as something more than their own, because within that community of warriors, who were already remarkable, already chosen by a system that required exceptional physical gifts and intellectual capacity in equal measure, already defined by their position outside the ordinary social structure of Ireland, living in the wilderness, owing allegiance only to the High King, and to Fionn, Oisín was recognized early as different even among the different. The Fionn were the warrior band of Irish mythological tradition, moving through the landscape of Ireland in the 3rd century as the tradition dates them, though the dating is a loose thing, more mythological than historical. They were hunters and defenders, living apart from settled communities, bound by Fionn's authority, and by a code that required them to be simultaneously formidable and refined. This was understood in the tradition not as a contradiction, but as a single ideal. The person who was complete rather than specialized, who could be dangerous and gentle, and precise and generous within the same day, whose cultivation of one quality did not diminish the cultivation of any other. Oisín grew into that ideal and then exceeded it because the specific quality he brought to it was one that even the finest warriors of the Fianna could not fully match. He was a poet. This requires a moment's attention to understand what the word meant in the Irish tradition, because it meant considerably more than it tends to mean now. The poets of early Ireland, the Fillid, the singular of which is Fille, occupied a position within their society that was not primarily about composition, though composition was essential to it. The Fille was a keeper of memory, a historian, a genealogist, a praise singer, a satirist, a prophet, and an educator, all in one, and the training required to hold all of those functions was long and demanding, measured in years of memorization and practice. The highest rank within the bardic hierarchy was the Ollum, sometimes anglicized as Olave, the master poet, and below the Dollum was the Rigfile, the chief poet, the figure who occupied the apex of the poetic class within a particular household or warband. That was the position Oisín held among the Fianna. He was their Rigfile. He was the voice through which the deeds of his companions were given the form that allowed them to be remembered. In Welsh tradition, and in what can be recovered of Gaulish practice, the relationship between the warrior and the singer was similarly understood as complementary rather than opposed. The figure who could fight and compose was not considered to have divided his attention between two disciplines. He was considered to have achieved a fuller version of a single discipline, the discipline of being, in the fullest sense capable. In this tradition, the war cry and the lament for the fallen and the praise song and the satire were all expressions of the same fundamental human capacity, the capacity to give the world back to itself in words, to take what had happened and make it into something that could be kept and carried and passed forward. Oisín had that capacity at a level that the tradition presents as simply without parallel in his age, and he was, at the same time, a warrior of exceptional physical power. The two accounts of him exist together in the tradition without any suggestion of tension between them. He could run and hunt and fight alongside men who had been selected for exactly those qualities. in a company where the standards were already very high. He had his mother's otherworld grace and his father's mortal power, and the combination of those two inheritances gave him a quality that the sources returned to repeatedly, a quality of ease in the body, of movement that did not appear labored, of strength that expressed itself without apparent effort. Whether this had to do with his otherworld heritage, or simply with who he was, is a question the tradition does not separate out. It is simply how Oisín moved through the world. The Fianna moved through the great landscapes of mythological Ireland, through forests and along river banks, and across the wide moorland of the Midlands, and through the mountain passes of the West. And Oisín moved with them, and the things they did were remarkable in the way that the things the Fianna did were always remarkable, which is to say that the world they moved through was larger and stranger than the everyday world, populated with adversaries and wonders in roughly equal measure, and the life they lived in it was one of constant engagement with the extraordinary. This was ordinary life for them. The extraordinary was simply the texture of their days. In the evenings, when the hunting was done, and the fire was built, and the company settled around it, Oisín would compose. He would take what had happened, the specific events of that specific day, the names of the people involved, the landscape it had moved through, the quality of the light, and he would make verse from it. The tradition held that bardic verse of the highest order required not only technical mastery of the forms, which were numerous and demanding, but also a kind of attention to the world that was itself a form of perception, a way of seeing what was actually there, rather than what was convenient or flattering or safe to see. Oisín had that quality too. He could be trusted in his verse to tell the truth about what had happened, including the difficult parts of what had happened, and to find in the truth a form that made it worth carrying. His father Fionn mac Cumhel was also in the tradition associated with wisdom and with certain kinds of supernatural knowing. The story of how Fionn came to have that knowing is a famous one. The salmon of knowledge, caught by the poet Finn Esses on the River Boyne, which Fionn was set to cook, but not to eat, but which he burned himself on and instinctively sucked his thumb, and so received, accidentally, the salmon's gift of all knowledge, and it shaped the character of the man Fionn became. A war leader who was also a seer, a hunter who was also a keeper of old stories, a man of physical authority who was also at moments something quieter and stranger. Oisín inherited something of that quality, not the supernatural vision exactly, but a related thing, a fundamental orientation toward the world as something worth paying very close attention to, because what was actually in it, looked at carefully, was more interesting than any simplification of it. He had friends among the Fianna, and the tradition names several of them, each with their own distinct qualities. There was Kylie Nepacronin, who would outlive almost all of them, and who was the voice of memory in the Acolumna Sonoric, the great compendium of Fenian lore. There was Gall MacMorna, the complicated one, whose history with Fionn's family was tangled and old. There were the great warriors, and the great hunters, and the men known for their particular skills, each of them occupying a specific position in the ecology of the Fianna, each of them contributing something that the others could not contribute in quite the same way. And Oisín contributed poetry, the specific form of attention that turned experience into something that could be held after experience was over. He was, in this sense, the Fianna's memory. He was the one through whom what they did would survive. He was also, in the tradition, his father's beloved son. The relationship between Fionn and Oisín is characterized in the sources as one of deep mutual recognition, not uncomplicated, as such relationships rarely are, but grounded in something genuine. Fionn had searched for Sod for years. He had not found her. He had found instead their son, a child who carried her otherworld quality and his own warrior capacity in a combination that made him, in Fionn's eyes, something more than an heir, something irreplaceable. That quality of being irreplaceable to his father is part of what the tradition asks the listener to hold when it comes to what happens next, not as a source of anguish, but as a fact about the depth of what was there, and about what kind of person Oisín was, that he was known and loved, that fully by someone whose capacity to know and love was itself extraordinary. He was of middle age when she arrived, not old by any measure, and not young either, but somewhere in the full confidence of his strength, his craft at its highest, his reputation settled, and certain. The Fianna had been out on the plain of Munster, where the tradition says it was near the shores of Lough Lane in some accounts, or on the plain of Femin in others, because oral tradition moves its settings, as it moves from one teller to the next, preserving the substance of what happened while allowing the geography to settle where each tradition's land lies. What does not change between accounts is the quality of the morning. It was clear, the company was gathered, the dogs were resting, and from the direction of the sea, from the west, which in Irish mythological geography is always specifically the west, always the direction that carries otherworld meaning, something was coming. It was seen from a distance first, and the first thing that registered was the horse. Not the rider, the horse, because the horse was moving in a way that horses do not ordinarily move on solid ground, with a lightness that was not quite explained by its speed, a quality of something that was not quite touching what it was moving over, white and very large, and coming without urgency, but also without any sense that it could be slowed or diverted. The Fianna fell quiet, that kind of quiet, the particular silence that falls over a company of experienced warriors when something arrives that is outside their category of experience, is itself a kind of information. They had seen many remarkable things. This was different. The rider was a woman. Her hair was gold, not the yellow gold of fair human hair, but something brighter and more consistent, as if the color were not subject to the variation that natural things are subject to. Her eyes were the color of the sky at the particular moment when blue is becoming gray, and both are present. Her clothing was crimson silk, the mantle fastened at her shoulder with a golden brooch that caught the light in a way that caught the eye long after the eye had moved on to other things, a small heavy object of extraordinary craftsmanship, a single detail that the tradition returns to, as if it understood that the specificity of that clasp, its weight and workmanship, said something about the world she came from that no general description could say, a world where things were made with that quality of attention, a world where even the fastening of a garment was an act of craft done to its fullest possible extent. She came toward the gathering of the Fianna, and she came without hesitation, as if she had known exactly where they were and had been traveling in this direction for as long as the journey required. There was no moment of searching or uncertainty in her approach. She came to the specific place where Oisín stood, and she stopped, and the horse was still beneath her, and the silence of the company around them was total. Her name was Niam, Niam Chin Oir, Niam of the golden hair, the form the tradition uses most consistently. The name Niam carries in Irish the meaning of brightness or radiance, the quality of a surface that gives back light. The name is pronounced Niam, the single syllable, long and open, the sound of it fitting the quality it describes. She was the daughter of Manannán mac Lir, whose name identifies his domain, Maclir, meaning son of the sea being both his parentage and his territory. Manannán mac Lir was in the Irish tradition the lord of the otherworld and of the waters that surrounded and protected it, a figure of considerable authority within the mythological order, associated with transformation, with the passage between worlds, with the supernatural horse, and Bar, whose quality it was to cross water as easily as land, leaving the same light impression on both. The horse beneath Neem was Enbar, or connected to Enbar, the tradition slightly variable in its exact claim here, but consistent in the horse's nature, an animal of the otherworld, subject to different physical laws, carrying its rider across whatever surface lay between where she had come from and where she was going. She spoke, and the voice of the tradition describes her speaking as itself something apart from ordinary speech, not louder or stranger, but with a quality of precision and clarity that made everything she said land without ambiguity. She spoke to Oisín. She had come for Oisín, specifically, and she said so, and the tradition takes some time with what she said, because what she said was a description of a place, and the description was specific and beautiful and organized like a poem, which it was, Mitchell Coimín, the County Clare poet, who composed the Lawi Oisín, Artir na nOg, in the 18th century, giving Neam an arrival speech that is among the more striking passages in the text. She described a land to the west, a land where the blossoming trees did not shed their blossom, and the fruit on them was always ripe, and the rivers ran with honey and wine through plains that were always green, a land where no one aged, where no one sickened, where no one died, or grieved for dying, or carried in their body the accumulated damage of years lived through, where the halls were white and ornamented with gold, and the music that moved through them was of a quality that the tradition described as actively pleasurable, not just pleasant, but physically, genuinely, deeply pleasurable, the kind of pleasure that did not diminish with repetition, because it was not the repetition of anything limited. She described this land, and she described it as the place she came from, and she said that she had come here, across the water, and across the plain of Munster, or the plain of Femin, or wherever the Fianna were gathered on that clear morning, because she had chosen Oisín. She had known of him before she came. It's like the tradition does not explain fully what she knew, or how she knew it, but her arrival was not accidental, and her choice was not arbitrary. She had heard of him, of his poetry, of his gifts, of the quality that made him who he was, and she had come. The invitation she offered was genuine, and the love the tradition describes as motivating it was genuine, and the Lawe makes both of these things clear with a directness that requires no elaboration. Neem came because she wanted Oisín, and what she wanted was not a temporary visit or a supernatural transaction, but a life. In her country, as his companion, the Fianna was silent around them. Fionn mac Cumhaill, his father, who had found him on a hillside among deer, and given him his name and his place among the greatest warriors of his age, stood somewhere in that silence. The tradition does not report what Fionn said or did in this moment. It reports what Oisín did. He looked at Neam, and at the white horse beneath her, and at the gold brooch at her shoulder, and he said that he would go with her. There is no record of a long deliberation. There is no record of the night of thought that some tellings of analogous stories insert at this point. The hero weighing his options by a fire, the dawn bringing clarity. Oisín looked at Neam and he said yes. Whether this was the speed of a warrior's decision, the same quickness of judgment that the Fianna cultivated in combat, the capacity to assess and commit without the delay that kills, or something more fundamental, a recognition of the kind that does not require discussion. The tradition does not say, It simply records that he went. He mounted behind Neom on Imber, or, in some tellings, she brought a second horse, or he rode separately, and the company was ready, and the morning was still clear, and to the west the Atlantic lay wide and flat and full of light. He may have looked back. The tradition does not say he looked back, but the tradition also does not say he did not, and there are later poems in the Fenian cycle that attribute to him, in his old age, a vivid and detailed memory of that morning, of the plane in the sky and the specific quality of the light, which suggests that he carried the image of it with him into the otherworld and held it there, unchanged, the way things you love tend to be held. What the tradition is clear about is that the departure was without anguish. He was going toward something he wanted to go toward, with someone who had come specifically for him, on a horse that crossed water as easily as ground, in the direction that the Irish imagination had always understood as the direction of transformation and of the world beyond ordinary sight. The departure from Ireland, in this moment, was not a loss, it was a beginning. Imbar's hooves left the last of the Irish ground, the coast of Connacht, or Munster, or wherever the plain ended, and the shore began, and found the surface of the Atlantic without breaking stride. The water accepted the horse's weight, the spray rose in fine arcs from each hoof-fall, and fell back, and the Irish coast began its slow reduction into something smaller. The mountains were there for a while, specific ones, identifiable, their profiles known to anyone who had grown up in the west of Ireland, as the Fianna had grown up there, hunting and camping in their shadows. They shrank. The particular shapes of headlands, the long lines of cliffs, the places where the land ran down to the sea in fields that had names and histories, became a single dark line. The line held for a while, then it did not. What remained, as the Irish shore dissolved into the gray Atlantic distance behind them, was the surface of the sea, wide and stippled with light, the horizon ahead no different yet than the horizon behind, the sky and the water holding the same relationship they had always held, the world immense and undifferentiated, and moving past at the speed of a supernatural horse running. Neem's golden hair was ahead of him, catching the light. The brooch at her shoulder caught it too. The horse beneath them was steady and unhurried, its motion the same on water as it had been on land, the different surface making no difference to the animal that had always treated both as equivalent. The crossing, in the Lowie, is not empty. Things pass. A hornless doe runs across the water in the middle distance, pursued by a white hound with one ear turned red, the two animals moving in their own urgent relationship with somewhere specific, belonging to a story that was not this one, carrying in their appearance the quality of the Irish otherworld, a place dense with narrative, full of events that are always already underway, the stories multiplying beyond the edges of any single account. A young woman passes on horseback, carrying a golden apple, her direction purposeful, her gaze belonging to whatever it is she is traveling toward. A horseman in crimson follows, carrying a sword of gold, and he and the woman and the apple are all traveling somewhere together in the way of mythological figures whose significance is held by the tradition at a certain productive distance, the detail present and specific and unexplained. These figures are signposts. They tell Oisín, and anyone reading the poem, that he is in the otherworld's approach now, in the water that surrounds and leads to it, the threshold space where the categories of the ordinary world are already loosening and something else is becoming possible. Oisín watched them pass, and the tradition records his attention to them without recording alarm. He looked, he noted. They went. The horse moved on across the bright gray surface of the water, and ahead, where there had been only horizon, only the flat edge of the known world, and the sky above it, something was becoming visible. The word Oisín means little deer. It means fawn. It means the small form of the animal that stands at the edge of two different kinds of world and belongs to both. The man who carried that name had been a warrior and a chief poet, a son and a father-to-be, the living memory of the greatest warrior band in the mythological history of Ireland. He had been found on a hillside and given a name that told the truth about what he was. He had been given gifts, the gift of the body, and the gift of the voice, and the gift of the attention that could make a world out of what it saw, and he had used them fully. In the years of his life among the Fianna, in the verse he composed at the evening fire, in the specific quality of presence he brought to everything he did. Now the shore of Ireland was gone behind him. The other world was gathering itself in the distance ahead. The horse ran on, steady and unhurried, across the water. Oisín, across a wide plain in the west of Ireland, on a morning when the Fianna had gathered to hunt, the grass bent under a wind coming off the sea. The hounds were ranging ahead, the horses standing easy, and the men were at rest in that particular stillness that comes after hard movement, warmed through, unhurried, the morning still full in front of them. It was into this quiet that the horse first appeared. It came from the direction of the sea. That detail matters in the older sources, and the tradition holds it carefully, not from the north or from the inland hills, but from the west, from the water, from the direction that already meant something in the cosmological understanding of the Irish world. The horse was white, or close enough to white that the distinction seemed unimportant, against the gray-green of the plain, and it moved in a way that drew the eye before anything could be said about it, not fast exactly, not slow exactly, but with a quality of movement that made the grass in the distance look like things it did not have to negotiate. The warriors watching it go still, no particular word passed among them. There was simply a quality of shared attention, the kind that does not need to announce itself, and the sound of the hounds in the distance, and then the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the west. The rider was a woman. She sat the horse without visible effort, the way a person sits in a place they have always been, and as the distance closed between her and the gathered Fianna, what became visible first was her hair, the color the tradition consistently names as gold, not as a flattering metaphor, but as a specific observed quality. Gold, the way a particular light falling at a particular hour on a particular surface produces something the eye simply records and moves on from, because there is nothing to question about it. Her mantle was crimson silk. At her shoulder, holding it, a golden brooch caught the morning and gave the light back unhurried. She came on at the same steady pace, neither slowing nor quickening, and the Fianna stood as they were and watched her come. Her name, spoken a moment later in greeting, was Niam Chin Or, Niam of the golden hair, a daughter, the tradition holds, of Manannán mac Lir, the lord of the sea and of the western otherworld, whose domain began at the edge of the Atlantic and extended into a geography that followed different rules. Her father's name carries inside it his nature, Manannán, son of Lir, where Lir means simply the sea, so that the god's parentage is a description of what he governs, the divine lord of the water and everything beyond it. Manannán was understood in the older sources as the keeper of the western otherworld, the guardian of Tir na nOg, the figure at the threshold between the mortal world and the place that lay past the horizon. He was also the owner of a horse. That horse, Enbear, or Embar, as the name appears in various sources, was described in the Irish mythological tradition as capable of crossing water as easily as land, its hooves finding the wave tops with the same sureness they found the earth, the sea beneath them simply a different kind of ground. The name itself carries something of this quality, connected in one reading to the Irish word for imagination or fancy, in another to the word for the froth of a wave, and in both readings the name does what the best names in this tradition do. It describes the thing's nature rather than simply marking it out from other things. A horse named for the foam it runs across, or for the quality of mind that moves between the possible and the impossible without noticing the boundary. It was this horse, or one closely related to it in the tradition, on which Niamh had crossed the sea that morning. She rode to where the Fianna stood, and she stopped, and she looked at the assembled company with an attention that seemed neither hurried nor theatrical, and then she spoke. The tradition gives her words in Irish verse, formal and composed, with the cadences of a declaration made before witnesses. She had come, she said, from a land to the west. She had come because of a particular man among the Fianna. She had come for Oisín, the faun-named poet, the son of Fianna, the warrior who was also the chief singer of his age, because she had heard of him in the place where she lived, because his name and his gifts had traveled further than he knew, because in Tir na nOg she had wanted him and had come to find him. The declaration was made with complete composure. There was nothing in it of desperation or performance, no quality of urgency straining at the edges of the words. The Lawi Oisín are Tir na nOg, the long poem composed by the County Clare poet Michael Coimín in the 18th century, and drawing on oral traditions that run much older than that text, gives Niamh's arrival a quality of settled certainty, as though the invitation had been prepared for long before it was delivered, as though the distance she had crossed to extend it was something she had taken into account well in advance and found acceptable. She had come a long way for a specific reason. The reason was standing in front of her. Oisín, when he is described in these first moments of the encounter, is described as one who already recognized something in the woman on the white horse, not quite recognition in the personal sense, not the face of someone known, but a quality of response that the older Irish narrative tradition associates with proximity to the other world, a kind of clarity, a loosening of the ordinary anchoring of the attention, a sense that the world had just become slightly more than it had been a moment ago. He asked her to describe the place she came from. The Lawi gives him the question and gives her the answer in a passage of verse that is among the most sustained geographical descriptions in the Irish otherworld tradition. Tir na nOg, she told him, was a land of green plains and blossoming hills. Its rivers ran with honey and wine. Its trees bore fruit and flower at the same time, perpetually, without the cycle of growth and dormancy that governed the mortal world. Its palaces were built from white stone, ornamented with gold and gems, and in those palaces the tables were never bare, and the music never stopped, and no one who lived there had ever grown old. She spoke as someone describing a place they know well and love plainly, without ornament, without the particular inflation that comes from wanting to persuade. The description was what the place was. He could come and see it for himself. There is a moment in the story, preserved in the oral tradition and present in the texture of the Lao, where Oisín looks toward his father, Fionn Macumhal, the great leader, the warrior and seer, the man who had found a child standing among deer on the slopes of Ben Bulben and recognized in him a son, stands watching, and in his watching there is something that the narration touches briefly and then moves past. The Lawe does not dwell in it. The tradition does not dwell in it. There is a look between father and son, the specific look of two people who understand that something is changing and have not yet decided what to do with that understanding. And then Oisín turns and answers nOg. He would go with her. The words are recorded in verse, formal and affirming, carrying the quality of a vow freely spoken, the decision made with full attention and full will. He would go with her to Tir na nOg, across the western sea, to the land where no one grows old, where the palaces were white, and the rivers ran with honey, and the music never stopped, and Niamh herself was waiting for him in a life that would never diminish. He asked for his horse and his weapons, and the tradition records this detail with care, because it is the detail of a warrior setting out rather than a man being taken, the choice expressed in the practical language of a man preparing for a journey. Fionn is described in some versions as weeping. The tradition allows him this, and then moves on. Oisín mounted behind Niamh on Ember, the white horse, the wave-named horse, the horse that moved between the possible and the impossible without marking the boundary, and the animal turned west. The Fianna, the tradition tells, stood and watched as the horse began to move, and then began to move faster, and then moved with the quality of something no longer quite touching the ground. The plain fell behind them, the sound of the hounds fell behind them, the sound of anything that was not the wind, and the rhythm of the horse's hooves fell behind them, and then the land fell behind them too, and the gray Atlantic opened in front of them, wide and bright, and going on further than the eye could reach. Here is what the Lowy describes next, and it is one of the passages that gives the poem its particular character among the otherworld narratives of the Irish tradition. The sea crossing is not simply a journey from one shore to another. It is a passage through a landscape that operates by its own logic, arranged in sequence like the images of a long dream, each one complete in itself and moving past before it can be fully held. Imbar's hooves met the wave tops, and the wave tops accepted them, and the water moved underneath as the grass had moved on the plain, and the coast of Ireland began to do what distant things do, to reduce, to flatten, to become a dark line at the edge of everything behind them. The wind came up favorable. In the tradition, a favorable wind is not a neutral meteorological detail, but a confirmation, a sign that the journey is going in a direction the world accepts. The spray rose from the hoofbeats in fine arcs, catching whatever light was available and returning it for a moment before falling back. Niamh rode ahead, composed and certain, the golden hair and the crimson mantle catching the sea wind. Oisín, behind her, was looking at what the crossing put in front of him. The first figure that passed was a doe, hornless, moving fast across the surface of the water in the middle distance, and behind her a white hound with one red ear, the red ear the traditional marker in the Irish otherworld literature of an animal that comes from the other side of the visible world. The doe and the hound moved together, neither gaining nor losing, traveling with the particular quality of things that have been moving towards something specific for a very long time and have not yet arrived. They passed without turning, without acknowledging Imbaird or the riders on his back, going somewhere else, belonging to a story that had its own beginning and its own terms. The Lowy records their passing without commentary, without explanation. They were there, and then they were not there, and the sea surface was empty again in the direction they had gone. Then a young woman on horseback, moving across the sea at a pace that matched the crossing, carrying in her right hand a golden apple. She did not look at Oisín. She was not looking at anything in the distance he could see. She held the apple with the particular attention of someone conveying something of great importance from one place to another, and the apple caught the light and gave it back gold, and she went past and was gone. and then a horseman in crimson, following the woman at a distance that did not close, carrying a sword the color of gold, riding hard and going nowhere closer, locked into the same distance behind her that he had been at when he first became visible. The horseman's face, in the tradition, is not described. What is described is the sword, the color of the mantle, the urgency of the pace. He too belonged to something that was not this story. He passed, and the sea closed around his passage, and the surface of the Atlantic was empty again in all directions. Scholars who have worked closely with the Lawi and with the broader tradition of Irish otherworld literature have identified these three passing figures: the hornless doe, the white hound, the woman with the apple, the pursuing horseman, as fragments. Each of them belongs in the older tradition to a narrative of its own, and their appearance in the crossing sequence has been understood as the poem's way of signaling the density of the mythological landscape being entered, a space where other stories are also happening, where the other world is not a backdrop, but a fully inhabited country with its own ongoing events and its own unresolved pursuits. They pass through Oisín's crossing, the way light from other windows passes through a room at night. You see it, you register it, you cannot read by it, and it is gone. The crossing continued. Imbar ran on, hooves finding the wavetops, the spray rising and falling, the wind favorable and constant. The Irish coast behind them had reduced to a dark line, then less than a line, then to nothing, absorbed into the gray of the horizon, the way the horizon absorbs all things that recede far enough. In front of them, the sea went on, and then, at the edge of where the light fell differently, something else began. It came into view the way land comes into view from a ship's deck, gradually, incrementally, first as a suggestion of shape, and then as a specific outline, becoming more specific with each movement forward. What was visible first were hills, green hills, rising out of the sea with the solidity of things that had always been there. Then the color deepened and spread, that particular green the tradition reserves for Tir na nOg, which is the green of a place where nothing has ever died, where the grass has never gone brown, where the leaf has never fallen. Then, as Imbar closed the distance, something white catching the light at the summit of a rise, a wall, or the face of a building, bright as something new. The smell of blossom came before the shore. That detail is in the tradition, and it is worth dwelling in. The smell arriving before the sight was complete, carried on the same favorable wind that had brought them across, a confirmation through a different sense that the land was real and there and waiting. The smell of apple blossom or something close to it. The tradition does not insist on the specific flower, only on the quality of the scent, which is described as gentle and pervasive and without any edge of decay. Blossom without the fruit that follows, flowers without the falling. Then the sound of the shore. Not the sound of an ordinary shore, the hard, irregular, percussive sound of waves against stone, but something softer and more continuous, water meeting land in a way that did not involve force, arriving gently, settling, returning, arriving again. The rhythm of it was the rhythm of breathing, if breathing had never needed to stop. And Barger's hooves found the shore and crossed from water to ground with no particular change in movement, the transition unremarkable to the horse. They were in Tir na nOg. The crossing was complete. Niamh turned to look at Oisín, and the tradition in this moment is very simple. She said, "This is my home." In the Lawi and in the oral accounts that carry this story forward, those words, or words with the same weight, mark the end of the crossing and the beginning of everything that follows. Not an announcement or an explanation, but a statement of the plainest kind. the kind a person makes when they want someone they care for to understand that this is not a temporary place, and this is not a performance of welcome, and this is not a dream. This is the ground. This is real. This is where she lived. The palaces were visible from the shore. White stone, the walls high and bright in the particular light of Tir na nOg, which the tradition describes as neither the direct light of a sun overhead, nor the indirect light of a cloudy sky, but a third thing, suffused and even, as though the light came from several directions at once and agreed with all of them. The ornamentation of the buildings caught this light and gave it back in fragments, the goldwork in the archways, the gems set into the facing of the walls, the cups and vessels visible through an open gate, all of it contributing to a total impression that the tradition names as abundance, but that is more specific than abundance. It is the visual quality of a place where nothing is running short, where there is no reason to be careful with what there is, because what there is does not diminish. Around the palaces, the land spread in every direction. Green plains, the grass long and even, hills in the middle distance, covered in blossom, a river somewhere below the line of a ridge, audible before it was visible, running with the ease of water that has always found its way, trees, heavy with fruit and flower at the same time, neither quality diminishing the other, the fruit full and ripe and holding its ripeness without tipping into the softness that comes before falling. The tradition is specific about this. The fruit does not fall in Tir na nOg. The blossom does not finish and brown and drop. The tree holds both states simultaneously, because in Tir na nOg, the cycle that requires one state to end before another can begin simply does not operate. There is no winter in this account. There is no autumn. There is only this. Figures were visible moving between the buildings and along the paths between the hills. The inhabitants of Tir na nOg, the tradition's permanent young, each of them as they had been at the moment of their highest vitality, moving with the ease of people who have no reason to conserve themselves because there is nothing to run out of. The tradition does not describe them closely in this moment of arrival. It is enough that they are there and that none of them is old, and that the quality of movement among them is the quality of movement among people who have nowhere they need to be in a hurry. A formal welcome was made. The Lowy describes it in the conventions of Irish royal hospitality, a procession of nobles coming out to meet the returning Niamh and her companion, the gates of the palace open, the sounds of music and celebration audible from within the great hall. The welcome was not for a stranger. It was for the man Niamh had gone to bring home, and the word home here is the tradition's word, used with full weight. He had been waited for. His arrival had been anticipated. The chair that stood beside Niamh's was waiting to be occupied. Oisín walked through the gates of the palace in Tir na nOg on a day that would not end in the way days in the mortal world ended, into a hall that was lit with the same undirected, even light as the landscape outside. And the doors closed behind him, and the sound of the world he had left became the sound of something very far away, and then became no sound at all. What he had brought with him, beyond his weapons and his warrior's body, and the particular quality of attention that made him the greatest poet of his age, was a specific orientation to language, the way a reptile, a chief poet, inhabits the world with one part of his awareness always engaged in turning what is in front of him into the compressed and durable form of verse. In Tir na nOg that orientation would not be abandoned. The tradition's Oisín is a man for whom observation and utterance were not separate activities, but a single continuous one, and the landscape he now inhabited, the rivers that ran with honey, the trees that held blossom and fruit simultaneously, the light that fell from everywhere and nowhere, was the kind of landscape that demanded to be described. In some versions of the tradition, what Oisín did in his time in Tir na nOg was precisely what he had done among the Fianna. He composed, he sang, he gave the world back to itself in language, and in that land, the language he gave it back in was a language without grief in it, without the weight of anything coming to an end. The marriage is described in the Locks, in the formal language of otherworld royal ceremony, Niam and Oisín, before the assembled court of Tir na nOg, the vow spoken, the feast that followed, and in the life that settled around the marriage, the tradition places children, 2 sons, named Fionn and Oscar, the names carrying the mortal world's lineage forward into the other world, the grandfather's name and the grandson's name given to children growing up in a place where neither grandfather nor grandson could age, and a daughter whose name in the tradition is Plornamban, the flower of women, a name that is itself a kind of song, 3 words that together make an image, a single flower, a single woman, the whole category of womanhood gathered into one specific instance of it, the daughter of the fawn-named warrior poet, and the golden-haired daughter of the Lord of the Sea, growing up in a land where the blossom on the trees did not fall. The children confirm something that the tradition appears to want to confirm carefully, that life in Tir na nOg is not a suspension. It is not the held breath of an enchanted sleep, not a pause in a life that will resume elsewhere, not a beautiful interval between 2 more real states. The children are a life. They are the evidence of time moving, of something being built, of the specific ongoing accumulation that distinguishes inhabiting a place from merely visiting it. Oisín was not waiting in Tir na nOg. He was living there, and the time moved in the way the tradition describes otherworld time as moving, which is to say, in the way a long and undisturbed sleep moves, continuously, without the markers that in the mortal world punctuate the passage of years. No harvest to measure the turning of the season, no birthday that arrived with a new line on the face, no friend grown slower and quieter since the last meeting. The hall after a feast looked the same as the hall before the next one. The light that fell through the doorway in the morning was the same light that had fallen through it the morning before, and the morning before that, not because the light was static, but because it was not diminishing toward anything. Nothing in Tir na nOg moved toward an ending. In this, the tradition makes a distinction that is worth staying with. The absence of aging in Tir na nOg is not the absence of experience. The Laui is careful about this in its way. The feasting happens, the music happens, the hunting happens, in the green hills with their rivers and their long-grassed plains. Events occur, conversations are had, children are born and grow, and are present in the life of the place. The other world of the Irish tradition is not a state of frozen suspension, not amber in which the inhabitants are preserved but inert. What is absent is not life, but the particular form of loss that in the mortal world is woven into the structure of every hour, the awareness that the hour is passing, that the feast will end, that the music will stop, that the face in front of you will not always look the way it looks now. The feast in Tir na nOg ended, and another feast began, and the interval between them contained music and rest, and the particular pleasure of a morning that was simply a morning, without urgency. The hunting party went out into the green hills, and the hounds ran in the long grass, and the game was found, and the day went through its sequence, and the evening came, an evening that was not the diminishing kind, not the evening that means the coming of dark and cold, and the shortening of everything, but simply the time of day after the afternoon, when the light fell at a lower angle, and the sound of harping began in the great hall, and the fires were lit not against the cold, but as a thing worth having, warm and companionable, adding a quality to the room rather than defending against an absence. The harping that the Lawi describes in Tir na nOg is one of the tradition's persistent details, and it is worth allowing it to be specific. The music of the Irish otherworld, in the broader tradition, not only in the accounts of Tir na nOg, but in the older mythological narratives, where the otherworld intersects with the mortal world, is described as supernatural in a particular way. It does not exceed the normal boundaries of what music can do. It perfects what music can do. The effect the tradition ascribes to otherworld harping is the effect the best music approaches at its most achieved moments, a complete and voluntary relinquishment of the attention, the listener going entirely into the sound, and the sound holding them there, not in unconsciousness, but in a state the tradition describes as blissful and calm and requiring nothing. The harp played, and the hall listened, and the listening required no effort and produced no restlessness. Oisín sat in the hall of Niam's father's country, in the light that came from everywhere and fell evenly on everything, and the music played, and the years did not count themselves. How many years? The tradition says 300. The number is given in the Lawi and in the oral accounts, and it is offered with the particular matter-of-factness that the Irish mythological tradition uses for large numbers, not as a figure that is intended to stagger, not as a count that was kept, but as the retrospective measurement of something that while it was happening had no quantity attached to it. 300 years in Tir na nOg were experienced, the tradition holds, as something substantially shorter, not because time was compressed or distorted, but because the markers by which mortal time is measured were not present. The grief that marks each year, the aging that makes each decade legible on the face and the body, the loss that turns a date on a calendar into something heavier than a number. In the absence of these markers, 300 years passed the way a night of good sleep passes, complete and ungrudged, with no sense during it of how much of it has gone. In the great hall of Tir na nOg, 100 warriors rested with their drinking vessels and their hounds lying quiet at their feet. 100 women sang, in the tradition's preferred large numbers, which are the numbers of abundance, rather than of census, filling the room with sound, the way the light filled it, from everywhere, even requiring no source to be sought. The fires burned, and the harp played, and the table held its dishes, and the conversation was the conversation of people who have everything they need, and no quarrel with their evening. Oisín's daughter, Plornaban, the flower of women, grew in this hall, in a country where nothing decayed, where the blossom on the trees outside the window did not fall. She grew the way children grow everywhere. Incrementally, daily, the changes small enough on any given morning to be unnoticed and large enough across a span of seasons to be remarkable. She grew without the context that most childhoods have, without any elder face in the family showing her what time does, without the year's cycle teaching her what loss looks like at the small scale before it teaches her at the larger. The world she was learning to inhabit was a world where continuity was not a thing to hope for, but a given, as much a feature of the air as the light was. She would have learned to ride across those green plains, this child, and to swim in the rivers that ran with honey and wine, and to sit in the evenings when the harping began, and let the music do what otherworld music does. She would have known her father as a man who was always the same age he had been when she first became aware of him, the broad-shouldered warrior with the poet's attention, sitting sometimes in the hall with the quality of a man composing, the words assembling themselves somewhere in his awareness, in the meters of the bardic tradition he had carried across the sea, and Niam at the center of all of it, golden-haired and composed, the same woman who had crossed the sea on a favorable morning and ridden across the plain of the Fianna with the specific certainty of someone who knows where they are going. She had known what she was building when she had gone to find Oisín. She had known the shape of the life she was offering. She had come for a specific man, and she had brought him home, and the home was real, and the life in it was real, and the 300 years that passed in it were real, in the way that only things lived, rather than endured, can be real. The rivers ran, the blossom held on the branches. The great hall was warm with fires and filled with music, and outside the hills went on green to the horizon, and beyond the horizon the sea that had carried a faun named Warrior across its surface on a favorable morning lay wide and quiet and silver in the undimming light of Tir na nOg. In the meadows that spread below the white-walled palaces, a man might stand and look across the grass toward the hills and feel not the urgency to hold the moment before it passed, but the simple and unremarkable fact of the moment continuing. The grass was the same. The sky above the hills was the same. The distance between where he stood and the line where the land met the sky was the same distance it had always been, and behind him the sound of the harp from the hall was the same sound it had been when he first heard it, and the smell of blossom from the trees on the hillside was the same smell that had come to him across the sea before the shore was even visible. On a morning a very long time ago now, and not long ago at all, he stood there, and the light came from everywhere, and the blossom held on the branch, and the river moved in its course between the grassy banks, bright and unhurried, going nowhere it had not always been going. 300 years, not a thinning of days, not a waiting room with beautiful walls. A life fully inhabited, with children and music, and the ongoing pleasure of a world that did not pull its loveliest things away before you had finished with them. A life in a land that kept its promises. The meadow in the middle distance was green. The hills beyond it held the same outline they had held when he first saw them rising out of the sea, and the sky above was the broad and undiminishing sky of a place that knew nothing about the word ending. He stood in it, this man who was also a poet, and what moved through his awareness was not the shadow of anything coming, but the full and present weight of everything that was already there. The shore of Tir na nOg came out of the water the way a thought rises before it becomes a word, slowly, with its full shape already formed. Green hills first, gathering themselves above the surface of the sea, then the white walls of something built catching the morning light on their upper courses, the stone pale and clean against the hills behind it. The smell arrived before the sound did, something flowering, something that had always been flowering, a sweetness without weight or edge that settled into the chest without asking permission. Then the sound of the shore itself, a low continuous breathing, water moving against land, with the particular ease of two things that have long since made their peace with each other. Oisín had heard music before. He had composed it, carried it in his body through the long evenings of the Fianna's encampments, let it move through him as naturally as breath. What reached him now across the last stretch of water was not entirely different from that. It was simply more settled. It was music that had never had any reason to stop. Imbar's hooves found ground, and the crossing was over. What the oldest accounts describe of Tir na nOg is not a place built to be looked at. It is a place built to be inside. The difference matters. A landscape constructed for display announces itself. It positions the onlooker at a distance, arranges its beauties toward the eye. What the tradition holds about Tir na nOg is that it did the opposite. It drew everything inward, offered itself from all directions at once, and made no distinction between the person standing in it and the ground beneath their feet. Green plains that opened in every direction without diminishing. Hills clothed in blossom that did not mark any particular season, because every season was equally present, equally unhurried. Rivers running between their banks with a sound like a low conversation in a language that required nothing in response. The Lawi Oisín Tir nOg, the long 18th century poem that carries the fullest surviving account of this place, describes rivers of honey and wine moving through meadows, and palaces of white stone set with gold and precious gems, standing at intervals in the landscape, like things that had grown there rather than been constructed, as natural in their positions as the hills behind them, as unremarkable as trees. The combination is deliberate. The Irish ideal the sources are reaching for is not natural beauty alone, nor splendor alone, but both held simultaneously, the pastoral and the magnificent, the unhewn and the perfected, occupying the same air without contradiction. The palaces themselves were large, not large in the way that announces ambition, but large in the way that makes everything inside them comfortable. Rooms that could contain 100 people and still feel unhurried, ceilings high enough that the lamplight never quite reached them, walls that held the warmth of a fire on one side without pressing it toward the other. The Lawi carries specific numbers in describing these halls: 100 warriors at rest, 100 women singing at their work, 100 hounds lying quiet with their heads on their forepaws. And those numbers are conventional ones, the traditional Irish idiom for fullness and completeness rather than any precise count. What they describe, in their way, is exactly right. Rooms that were full but not crowded, inhabited to their proper capacity, every person and creature within them occupying exactly the position they belonged in. A great hall in Tir nOg, in the hour after a feast, the food cleared and the harps brought out, the fire settled into deep orange coals, the hounds turning slowly in their sleep, the women's voices weaving something unhurried and intricate through the warm air above the company. That image, more than any geographical description, carries the felt texture of what the tradition was describing. Oisín was formally welcomed. The Lawi is careful about this. A feast was prepared in the otherworld's particular manner, not a meal that began and ended, but one that seemed to have been in progress already, and simply made room for 2 more. The tables already full of things that had always been there, the cups already filled. He and Niam were married in the custom of Tir nOg, in front of a company that included Niam's father, Manannán mac Lir, whose authority over the other world and the sea was old even by the standards of Irish mythology, a figure who appeared in the earliest layers of the tradition as a kind of primordial keeper of the threshold between the mortal world and whatever lay beyond it. Manon received Oisín not as an intruder or a curiosity, but as a son, which is to say, with the particular warmth of a welcome that does not need to announce itself. And with that welcome, Oisín's life in Tir nOg properly began. They had 3 children, 2 sons named Fionn and Osgur, carrying in their names the memory of the world Oisín had come from, his father and his son in the mortal order, reborn here with the same names in a place where no one aged, and a daughter whose name the tradition gives as Plornam Ben, Flower of Women. That name is worth sitting with for a moment because it is doing something quiet and particular. It is the kind of name that could only be given in a place where beauty was not exceptional, where calling a child Flower of Women was not hyperbole, but simply an accurate description of what she was among the other women of Tir nOg, all of whom were already beautiful beyond any mortal comparison, all of whom were already perpetually at the height of what they were. In any other country, such a name would be a poet's extravagance. Here it was a statement of plain fact. Plarna Man grew up in a landscape where the blossom on the trees did not fall. She learned to walk on grass that did not yellow in autumn, beneath a sky that moved through its ordinary changes of light, in cloud and color, without carrying any of the weight those changes carry in mortal countries, where the shortening of the days announces something, where the quality of autumn light is already a kind of farewell. She grew to whatever her full height was going to be. She learned whatever a child learns in Tir na Nog. Her brothers grew too, in their own time, Fionn and Oscar taking on the particular qualities that the other world allowed: strength, grace, the ease of beings who had never known diminishment. The three children of Oisín and Niam grew up in a place where growth itself was the only change that was permitted, where development was possible, but its opposite was not. This is one of the more intricate things the tradition holds about Tir na Nog, that it was not static, the misunderstanding of it as a kind of frozen paradise, a place where nothing changed, and therefore nothing was truly alive, misses what the sources are actually describing. Children were born there. They grew. Music was composed, which means something was being made that had not existed before. Feasts were prepared, hunts were organized. The constant cycle of activity described in the Lawi, the feasting, the music, the companionship, the hunt, was not a wheel endlessly repeating the same moment, but a life genuinely lived, with all the variety that life requires. What was absent was not change itself. What was absent was change's particular shadow, the way change in the mortal world arrives accompanied by the knowledge that it cannot be undone, that the thing changing is moving toward its end. In Tir na Nog, change was present, only the ending was removed. The scholars who have examined the tradition's treatment of otherworld time, its most structurally interesting feature, have noted that the disjunction between mortal and otherworld experience of duration is one of the most consistent elements in Irish supernatural narrative. Dathy Oscarin, among others, has identified this pattern across a wide range of Irish sources. The traveler who enters the otherworld and spends what feels like a season or a year returns to find that a century has passed in the mortal world. The mechanism, whatever its origins, and scholars have proposed connections to everything from shamanic trance traditions to the general human experience of time moving differently in states of joy or absorption, produces the same structural result in story after story. The other world runs on its own time. The two times are not synchronized, and the traveler who crosses between them without taking careful account of this discovers the difference at the worst possible moment, when the two times are suddenly and irrevocably reconciled. In Oisín's case, the tradition says 300 years. It says it consistently across the Lawi and the oral accounts that preceded and surrounded the Lawi's composition. 300 years elapsed in Ireland, while Oisín lived his life in Tir na Nog. 300 years during which Fionn mac Cumhal died, and the Fionn dissolved, and the Ireland that had produced them both passed through generations of change and loss and transformation until it became an entirely different country. 300 years during which Christianity arrived and settled and built its monasteries and filled them with monks who had never heard of the Fianna except as old stories. All of that was happening in its ordinary mortal time, while Oisín stood in a meadow in Tir na Nog, watching his daughter learn to walk. But that is the nature of the disjunction. From inside Tir na Nog, none of that was perceptible. None of it was even imaginable. What Oisín experienced was simply the days as they came, the breakfasts, the hunts, the afternoons by the river, The evenings in the great hall with the harps playing, and the fire warm and neon beside him, and the children growing at their own unhurried pace. The 300 years did not feel like 300 years. They did not feel like any particular number of years at all. They felt like a life being lived at its proper pace, without pressure, without the drumbeat of urgency that mortal existence places under everything. The Laui describes it this way, as a period that passed with the ease of happiness, without the sensation of time accumulating, without any growing awareness that the number was rising. 300 years, experienced as what? As a good life, a full one, the kind that a person looking back at any given moment would say had been what it should be. The music is worth returning to because the tradition is specific about it in a way that matters for understanding what Tir na nOg actually provided. The harping described in the Laui is not simply pleasant background. It is described as having a particular effect on anyone who heard it, an effect that the oral tradition characterizes as a kind of luminous calm, a state in which every concern became small and every comfort became large, in which the ordinary friction of wanting things to be different dissolved. The Irish literary tradition associated this kind of music with the Aisling, the visionary dream poem in which a supernatural woman appears and the world she brings with her operates by different rules than the waking one. Whether the harp music of Tir na nOg belongs to that lineage is a question scholars have turned over with interest and without final agreement. What is clear is that the tradition treats the music as something more than entertainment, as a structural feature of the otherworld itself, as much a part of the landscape as the rivers and the blossomed hills, as much a guarantee of the life lived there as the permanent youth of the people who inhabited it. A harp being played in an otherworld hall at the hour after a feast, the strings struck slowly, the notes expanding into the room's warm air, and then settling, the sound traveling through the stone of the building and out through the high, narrow windows into the night outside, where it dissolved gradually into the sound of wind moving through trees that were always in blossom. Inside the hall, the 100 hounds turned in their sleep. The 100 women set down what they had been doing and listened. The fire burned down to its red coals without anyone moving to add to it. And Oisín sat in the place he had been given at the table and heard the music and was simply inside it, not transported by it, not overwhelmed by it, but settled into it, the way a body settles into warmth, without resistance, without effort. This was what 300 years felt like, more or less. Not a dramatic extended duration, a series of evenings, a series of mornings, a river that was always the same river, running over the same stones, with the same low sound, hills that wore the same light at the same hour of the day through every season, meals that were always abundant, conversation that was always easy, a woman beside him whose hair caught the firelight with the same gold it had caught the first time he had seen her coming across the plain. 300 years ago, or 3 years ago, or yesterday, the other world did not care which of those was technically correct. Time in Tir na nOg was not a column of numbers rising. It was simply the medium through which life moved, without weight, without the particular pressure of its own accumulation. The rivers of Tir na nOg are worth a moment. They appear in the Laui as part of the landscape's natural abundance, rivers of honey, rivers of wine, flowing between the green banks of the plains, alongside ordinary rivers of water. The image is extravagant by any realistic measure, and the tradition is clearly not asking for a realistic reading. What it is doing is translating a quality of the place into physical terms. The otherworld's generosity was so complete, so structurally built into the landscape, that even the waterways participated in it. The ground itself provided sweetness. The country's rivers ran with things that nourished and delighted without any effort of cultivation or husbandry. Nothing had to be worked for in the way that mortal abundance must be worked for, not because work was forbidden, but because the scarcity that makes work necessary simply did not exist. The rivers ran with honey and wine the way Irish rivers ran with water, because that was the nature of the ground they moved through, and the ground had always been that way, and there was no reason it would ever be otherwise. Oisín understood this over time, the way a person understands any place they have moved into from somewhere else, first noticing it because it was different, and then gradually ceasing to notice it because it had become ordinary. In Tir na nOg, what was ordinary was the absence of diminishment, the absence of the morning when a man woke up and found that his knees ached in a new way, or his vision had narrowed slightly at the edges, or the long run that had been easy at 30 was no longer easy at 40. None of that was coming. He knew it was not coming. And in the beginning, perhaps, that knowledge was something he was aware of, a background warmth, a persistent comfort, the specific relief of knowing that the thing most mortal men feared was simply not a feature of the country he now lived in. Over time, even that awareness faded. The comfort stopped being felt as a contrast and started being felt as simply the texture of the world, the way a person born near the sea stops hearing the sound of it, not because the sound has stopped, but because it has become so constant that it requires no attention to receive it. He hunted in Tir na nOg. This the tradition notes directly, as part of the cycle of life in the other world, and it makes a particular kind of sense. Oisín had been a hunter in Ireland, a member of the Fianna, whose entire existence was organized around the hunt, and he would have carried that love for it into whatever life he built. The hunting in Tir na nOg is not described in the same detail as the feasting and the music, but its presence in the cycle of activities the tradition names is significant. It means that Oisín's days had the shape of active days, days that moved through the landscape rather than resting in halls, days that began with the preparation of hounds and horses, and ended with the return, with whatever the hunt had produced, with the smell of the evening air, and the particular satisfaction of a body that had been used fully and was now ready to rest. He would have known in those hours on horseback through the green and unending plains of Tir na nOg that the body under him was unchanged from the day he had arrived, that the legs gripping the horse's sides were the same legs they had always been, that the arm holding the rein was carrying no additional weight of years. The sensation, once it stopped being remarkable, would simply have become the sensation of being himself, fully himself, without subtraction. The white stone of the otherworld palaces deserves a moment of attention because it appears consistently enough across the sources to suggest it was a deliberate image rather than a coincidental detail. In Irish tradition, white is a color associated with the supernatural in a specific way, not with purity in the Christian sense, not with the cold or the clinical, but with the otherworldly in a sense that carries both beauty and a gentle strangeness. The white hound with the red ear is a classic otherworld marker, the white horse, the woman in white moving through the mist. White in the Irish mythological tradition does not signal absence but presence, the particular vivid presence of things that come from elsewhere and are unmistakably different from the ordinary colors of the mortal world. The white stone of the otherworld palace caught light in a way that Irish limestone caught light, and yet was not quite the same, brighter, more constant, less responsive to the changes of weather and the passage of hours. Walls that held their color regardless of the time of day, that were as luminous in the gray afternoon as in the full sun. not as a magical effect that drew attention to itself, but simply as the natural way that building materials behaved in a country where the ordinary processes of weathering and staining did not apply. Oisín composed poetry in Tir na nOg. This is not stated directly in the lie, but it is structurally implied by everything the tradition holds about him and about the otherworld both. He had been a ridgephile in Ireland, a chief poet, a person for whom verse was not an occasional occupation, but the primary mode of his engagement with experience. The otherworld in the Irish tradition did not reduce its inhabitants. It fulfilled them. Everything a person was in the mortal world was continued in Tir na nOg at its highest pitch, not diminished by comparison with the supernatural, but elevated by it, which means Oisín's gift for verse, his particular capacity for taking the world as it was and returning it in a form that made its nature more visible, was a gift he would have continued using. He would have sat in the evenings in the great hall, or in the morning by the river, or in the quiet hour after the hunt, when the hounds were sleeping and the sky was the particular shade of late afternoon gold, that the otherworld sky did whatever it was going to do with gold, and he would have composed lines that no one outside Tir na nOg would ever hear, poems made in a place where no one grew old, in a language that was already ancient, about a life that was unlike any other life that had ever been described. The daughter, Plorna Meen, she comes back as an image because she carries something the sources leave implicit but worth tracing. She was born entirely in the otherworld. She had no memory of any other place. Tir na nOg was, for her, simply the world, not a destination reached through a sea crossing, not a reward obtained through some extraordinary circumstance, but the ordinary country she had grown up in, as unremarkable to her as any home is unremarkable to the person born into it. The rivers of honey, the blossomed hills, the great hall with its 100 hounds, the music at the end of every evening, these were not wonders to Plorna Ban. They were Tuesday. She would have had no reference point for the mortal world, no experience of the thing Tir na nOg was defined in contrast to. Aging, illness, grief, the slow diminishment of the body over decades, she had never seen any of those things. They would have been as abstract to her as colors are to someone who has always seen perfectly and cannot imagine the absence of light. This is one of the quieter aspects of the tradition's description of Tir na nOg, and perhaps one of its most interesting. The oldest inhabitants had arrived knowing what they had left. They carried with them the memory of the mortal world, not as a wound or a longing, necessarily, but as a frame of reference, a way of understanding what their lives in the other world meant, by contrast. But their children, and their children's children, would have had no such frame. For them, Tir na nOg was not a paradise, it was simply where things were. The absence of death was not a gift, because it could not be contrasted with the presence of it. The permanent blossomed hills were not beautiful in any extraordinary sense, because there were no unblossomed hills in living memory to compare them with. The tradition does not pursue this implication. It stays focused on Oisín, whose mortal origins give him the perspective the story requires. But the implication is there, quiet and interesting, in the existence of Plorna Ban. What did Oisín think about in the long afternoons by the river? The tradition does not say. It is not its nature to say. The Lawi describes the landscape and the life in broad, warm terms, the feast, the hunt, the music, the company of Naim, and does not spend much time on the interior experience of a man 300 years into a life in the other world. That interiority is offered to the imagination rather than furnished directly. What the sources give is a life that was, by every external measure, complete, full, a life that lacked nothing that a life requires. His children were there, his wife was there, his gift had not left him. The country was beautiful, the hall was warm, the music was playing. Whatever the tradition holds about what Tir na nOg provided, it was providing it completely, every day, without variation in its generosity or any sign of tiring. The river ran between its grass banks in the full light of a Tir na nOg afternoon, its surface broken and bright, where it moved over stones, slow and dark, where it ran through the shadow of the overhanging willows at the bend, the sound of it constant and particular and complete. Not loud, just present, the way a thing is present when it has been there long enough to become part of the air of a place, rather than something happening in it. Fish moved in the deep water under the willows, barely moving, holding their positions in the current with small adjustments of their fins, their sides catching whatever light got through the branches and flashing it back in brief pale signals. A heron stood at the shallows on the far bank, its gray head drawn down into its shoulders, its attention total and unhurried. It had been standing there for some time. It would stand there for some time more. There was no particular reason to be anywhere else. Oisín stood in the meadow above the river's bend and looked at the distance. The plain rolled out ahead of him, green and unhurried, the blossomed hills at its far edge holding their positions under the sky. Somewhere behind him, the white stone of the great palace caught the afternoon light on its upper walls and threw it back toward the west. The river spoke its low, constant speech to the stones of its bed. A single hound lay in the long grass, a little distance away, its ribcage rising and falling with the slow rhythm of a deep sleep, its legs moving slightly with whatever it was running through in its dreaming. The wind moved through the blossom on the nearest trees and carried the sweetness of it across the meadow without hurrying anywhere. This was the 100th year, perhaps, or the 200th, or somewhere between them in some position on the long arc of his time here that did not require a name or a number to be fully itself. The plain was the same, the sky was the same, the distance between him and the horizon was exactly as it had always been, the same measured expanse of green and light and the particular otherworld air, which moved through the body without leaving any trace of having passed, except a clean quiet settling in the chest and a slight softness at the backs of the eyes. He stood in it for a moment, or for longer than a moment. The otherworld did not always make the distinction easy, and the river continued below him, and the hound continued its dreaming in the grass, and the white walls of the palace behind him continued holding their light, and the blossomed hills at the far edge of the plain continued being what they had always been, without urgency, without any inclination to be otherwise. This is what the tradition holds about Tir na nOg, at its deepest register. Not that it was overwhelming, not that it announced itself as extraordinary, but that it simply continued, day arriving, with its full, unhurried light, the river in its banks, the hall warm in the evening with the hounds lying around the fire and the harps playing and the gold catching the lamplight from the high ceiling where the light never quite reached. Oisín's children growing at their own pace in a place where growth led nowhere, final. Niamh beside him with her gold hair and her gray-blue eyes and the quiet sureness of a person who has always belonged where she is. 300 years not accumulating, but simply persisting, a long, undisturbed present, warm and full, and without the shadow of ending. The meadow in the late afternoon, the river below, the hound dreaming in the long grass, the blossom held in the branches of trees that would never shed it, all of it exactly as it was, and Oisín standing in the middle of it, as whole as he had ever been, as unhurried as the afternoon itself. The horizon, the same familiar distance away that it had always been, the world of Tir na nOg, going quietly, generously, continuously about its existence around him, the way it had yesterday and the day before, and all the long, slow years before that, without any variation in its warmth, without any sign that it intended to stop. Oisín saw the coast of Ireland from the back of a horse moving across water, and for a moment, a long moment, held inside the particular stillness of something approaching from very far away. It looked exactly as he remembered it. The hills rose from the sea in the same slow curve. The headlands pushed out into the gray Atlantic at the same familiar angles, their dark shapes exactly as they had been in the part of his mind where Ireland had lived, unchanged for what felt like a long season and what had in fact been 300 years. The horse and bear moved beneath him with the same easy power it had always moved with, hooves touching the wave tops lightly, each stride carrying them closer to the land, and Oisín looked at the shore ahead of him and felt something loosen in his chest that had been held close and quiet for a very long time. He had not left against his will. That is worth holding clearly. He had not been taken from Tir na nOg against his will, and Niam had not wanted him to go. What had happened, in the oldest accounts of the tradition, was that something in him had turned, gradually, the way a river turns without announcing itself, and the turning had been toward Ireland, toward the particular smell of its rain, toward the sound of its rivers over limestone, toward the faces of the Fionn assembled at a fire on an autumn evening with the dark coming down around them. He had felt the pull of the mortal world the way a man sometimes feels, the pull of something he knew in childhood, not urgently, not painfully, but persistently, like a sound heard just below the threshold of attention that never quite resolves into silence. Niam had given him Embar. She had spoken the prohibition clearly, with care, the way someone speaks a thing they know and wish did not need saying. What the tradition holds of her words is their structure and their weight, that Oisín must not allow his feet to touch the ground of Ireland, because if they did, everything that Tir na nOg had held in suspension for those 300 years would fall upon him at once, and he would not be able to return to her. This is the form of the prohibition in the Irish tradition, the geis, the binding supernatural law that operates like gravity in the world. These stories describe, not as an arbitrary rule, but as a structural feature of the way things work. The other world held time differently. The mortal world held it in the ordinary way, and the two could not simply be walked between without something being paid. Oisín had understood her. He had held the knowledge of it as he crossed the sea, the horse running steadily beneath him, the Irish coast rising slowly out of the horizon ahead. The sky above Ireland was the particular gray-white of an overcast morning, the light diffuse and cool, the kind of light that falls without shadows and makes everything look slightly more present than it normally does. He had remembered that light. Tir na nOg had its own light, warmer, more constant, but the Irish sky had always been this specific thing, changeable and close, pressing gently down on the country beneath it. And he had not realized how much he had carried its memory until it was above him again. What he noticed first, though, before the sky, before the smell of wet grass and stone that began to reach him as Embar drew close to the shore, what he noticed first was the absence. He had expected to hear the Fianna, not their voices specifically, not words, but the particular sound of a large group of men living outdoors in the way the Fianna lived, the sound of horses and hounds, and equipment and fire, and the low continuous hum of a great band of warriors going about their lives in the ordinary fashion of warriors. He had expected something. Instead, there was nothing but the sound of wind across open ground, and from somewhere inland and to the south, something he could not immediately place, a bell. Steady, evenly spaced, made of metal, coming from a building whose outline he could see at the top of a low hill, a building that had not been there when he left. The Fianna were gone. The tradition is plain about this. 300 years had passed in Ireland in the ordinary mortal way, year following year in the counting manner of the mortal world, each one accumulating its particular weight of change. Fianna Mac Cumhel had been dead for centuries. The great hunts across the hills of Connacht and Munster and Leinster were finished. The laws and customs of the Fianna, the particular warrior ethic that had organized the lives of the men Oisín had known and run with and composed verse for across the whole of his first life, all of it was gone in the way that things go when enough time passes, dissolved not by catastrophe, but by the slow, ordinary process of the world becoming something different. What had replaced them in town after town as Oisín moved across the island on Ember's back was a landscape organized around different principles. Churches stood on hills where ring forts had stood. Monasteries occupied valleys. Men in plain robes moved between stone buildings at regular intervals, called there by the same steady bell he had heard from the shore. The language was recognizable, Irish, still Irish, the same words in the same grammatical forms, but the references in it had changed. The names that carried weight were different names. The stories that shaped the community's understanding of itself were drawn from different sources than the ones Oisín had grown up inside. He moved through this changed country carefully, the horse beneath him still carrying him several feet above the ground, still holding him out of contact with Irish soil. People looked up at him as he passed. They saw a man of impossible bearing, straight-backed, broad-shouldered, moving with the ease of someone who had not accumulated any of the ordinary costs of living, and they did not recognize what they were looking at. There was no frame for it. The man who rode above their roads on a white horse with a bearing like a figure from a story was a figure from a story, but the stories were no longer ones anyone around him was living inside. The way the fall happens differs between versions of the tradition, as oral stories told across centuries by different voices in different places will always develop their variations. In most of what has come down, Oisín sees a group of men struggling to lift a large stone, a millstone in some accounts, or a stone from the construction of a building, and something in him responds before the prohibition can hold it. He is a Fianna warrior. He is the son of Fionn Mac Cumhal. His first instinct when men are struggling with a physical task is to help, and the instinct is so deeply laid, so completely integrated into who he is, that it moves faster than thought. He leans down from Ember's back. What happens next is either the saddle girth breaking under the shift of his weight, or the saddle strap giving way as he reaches. The specific mechanism varies, but the result is the same in every version of the story. He goes over, and his feet touch the ground of Ireland. What the tradition describes in the instant afterward is the kind of thing that happens in mythological accounts when a prohibition of this structure is broken, not slowly, not with any period of grace, but immediately and completely. The 300 years that Tir na nOg had held in suspension fell upon him all at once. Muscles that had held their full strength for those 3 centuries became the muscles of a man 300 years older than his years. His hair went white, his sight dimmed toward blindness. The physical form that had crossed the sea on Imbar's back, the body of a warrior in his prime, carrying no more age than he had carried when he left Ireland as a young man, collapsed into the body that 300 years of mortal time would have produced. If mortal time had been allowed to touch him, he lay in the grass of Ireland, with the sky above him, and bear was gone, the horse returned, in the logic of otherworld objects, to the place it came from. The stone he had tried to help lift was still where it was. The men who had been struggling with it stood at a distance, looking at the figure that had fallen from the horse and aged into an old man in the space of a few seconds, with the particular expression of people encountering something for which they have no language. What is notable in the way the tradition handles this moment is the quality it assigns to what remained. Oisín was blind, or nearly so. He was ancient in body, unable to stand without assistance, unable to move across the landscape under his own power. 300 years had arrived on his body in a breath, and yet his voice remained exactly what it had been. The cadences of bardic verse, the formal structures, the meters, the particular musical quality of the verse tradition he had mastered alongside his spear and his sword in the years of the Fianna, none of that had gone anywhere. The years had taken his sight and his strength and his mobility, but the poems were still in him, as fully present as they had ever been, and when he opened his mouth to speak, what came out was still the voice of the Riegfeel, the chief poet of his age. This is the hinge point of the tradition's final movement, the point at which Oisín's story becomes something other than a tragedy of loss, without ceasing to be serious about what was lost. The Ireland he moved through was a country in the process of becoming Christian. The monastic tradition that had taken root there was by this point several centuries old, and among its defining activities was the preservation of knowledge in written form. The men in plain robes who moved between stone buildings at the sound of bells were also, in many cases, men who read and wrote, who sat in scriptoria and copied manuscripts, and who understood that the past had value and that its capture in writing was one of the forms that value could take. The figure Oisín encounters in the Akalamna Sonorat, a text compiled in the 12th century from material considerably older than the compilation itself, preserved in manuscripts including the Book of Lismore from the 15th century, is Caelta Macronain, his companion among the Fianna, similarly ancient and similarly preserved through some quality of otherworld contact. And in that tradition, the old survivors meet Patrick, the saint who had become the primary figure of Irish Christianity, and something extraordinary and quietly generous happens between them. Patrick listens. That is the first and most important thing the tradition holds about this encounter, that Patrick the saint, the representative of the new order, sits down with the last survivors of the old order and listens to what they have to say. The spirit of the Akalamna Sonorak is not conflict. It is not argument. It is conversation, long, careful, unhurried conversation between a man who carries the whole of the Fianna's world in his memory and a man who has the means to write it down and keep it. The old warrior speaks. The young monk writes. And the scratching of the stylus on vellum is the sound of one world being handed into the custody of another. What the tradition preserves of Oisín's role in this process, and it is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it is not a small thing, is that he became, in the last movement of his life, the vessel through which an entire lost world survived. The hunts, the battles, the feasts, the particular ethical code of the Fianna, the particular way they understood courage and loyalty, and what a man owed to his companions, the landscape of pre-Christian Ireland as the Fianna had moved through it, the mountains and rivers and plains, that the great warriors had run across in pursuit of deer and boar and the kinds of adventures that belonged to their world. All of it lived in Oisín's memory with the same clarity it had always had, because his memory, like his voice, had come through the 300 years intact. He gave it back. That is the shape of the tradition's ending, not a man who had everything taken from him, but a man who had been given, without knowing it, the specific gift of being able to return. He had gone to the place where time did not move, and come back with his memories completely undimmed, carrying inside him a world that had otherwise entirely dissolved, and the act of speaking those memories aloud to someone who wrote them down is the act that made the Fenian tradition available to every ear that has heard any of it since. Somewhere in the Akalam tradition, in some versions of the conversations between Oisín and the representatives of the new order, there is a moment that scholars have attended to with particular care, a moment in which the question of what becomes of Fionn and the warriors of the Fionn is raised in the context of the Christian framework, and a kind of answer is given. Some versions hold that Patrick received an assurance, or offered one, that divine mercy would reach the Fianna where they were, that the heroic pagan past would be granted, through some mechanism of grace, a form of continuity that the new faith could accommodate. The tradition is not specific about the mechanism. It is not a theological argument. It is the spirit of a culture that had the generosity to look at what it was replacing and say that it deserved to continue in some form, somewhere. The syncretic quality of Irish Christian culture, its particular willingness to hold the pre-Christian mythological inheritance with something like respect rather than hostility, produced across the manuscript tradition of the early medieval period a body of writing that is unlike anything else in European literature. The monks who copied the mythological texts were in many cases men of genuine learning and genuine faith who understood themselves to be doing something valuable by preserving these stories. The Book of the Dun Cow, the Book of Leinster, the Book of Lismore. These are Christian manuscripts produced in Christian monasteries, and inside them are the stories of the Tuatha De Danann, the Fianna, and the Otherworld, kept with the same careful attention as the scripture they appear alongside. Oisín's voice, the voice that remained when everything else the years could take had been taken, is the thread that runs through all of it. An old man in a stone room lit by a candle of whatever size the monastery allowed, his hair white, his eyes seeing only the interior landscape of memory, now rather than the room around him. And from that interior landscape, which contained green hills, and the sound of hounds, and the laughter of men around a fire, and the smell of roasting meat, and the feel of a spear in a well-made hand, and 300 years of a different kind of beauty entirely, the beauty of the place where no one grows old. He drew the stories and spoke them aloud, steadily, in the particular measured cadence of the bardic tradition, and the monk across from him wrote them down. What was lost in the fall from embers back into the grass of Ireland deserves a moment. The tradition does not minimize it. 300 years of the life Oisín had lived in Tir na nOg, the morning light over the plains of the otherworld, the texture of a country where nothing decayed, where the blossom on the trees did not fall, where Niamh's hair caught the light exactly as it had on the day she came to find him across the Irish plain on a white horse. His children, Fionn and Oscar, his 2 sons, growing up in a land where they would stay the age they were indefinitely, while their father lay in Irish grass, having aged 300 years in an instant. Plornam Ban, flower of women, his daughter, whose name alone carries the particular register of the otherworld, the way names in Tir na nOg tend to describe what they name directly and completely. He could not return. That is the structure of the prohibition. Once broken, the access it governed closes permanently. The horse was gone. The sea was still there, to the west, going on beyond the visible horizon toward a shore that could not now be reached. And somewhere beyond that horizon, in the tradition's geography, the land continued as it always had, unhurried, unchanged, the grass the same length, and the blossom on the same trees, and the rivers running between the same green banks, with the same particular sound, without him. This is the quality of loss the tradition describes, and it carries its weight without requiring intensification. What Oisín lost was real and complete, and the tradition does not pretend otherwise. What remained was also real, and also, in its own way, complete, and the tradition holds both of these things at the same time, without forcing them to resolve into something tidier than they actually were. The oral tradition kept Oisín's voice alive for centuries, before any of it was written down. The stories he told were told again by others, around fires, in halls, in the ordinary domestic spaces where stories live before they become manuscripts. The Fenian cycle of Irish mythology, the cycle centered on Fionn Macumhall and the Fianna, and the particular kind of heroic world they represented, is among the most extensively preserved bodies of oral narrative in the European tradition, and a significant portion of what survives in the manuscripts was attributed to Oisín directly, told in his voice, the first person of a very old man, describing what it had been like to be young forever and then not. Michael Coimín's Lawi Oisín Artir nOg, composed in County Clare in the 18th century, is the most complete surviving literary treatment of the story, running to approximately 493 quatrains in formal Irish verse. Coimín was working within a tradition that was already very old, drawing on oral accounts that had been circulating for centuries, on manuscript material, on the accumulated imaginative weight of a story that the Irish tradition had been telling and retelling in various forms since well before the Norman period. The Lawi is not the origin of the story. It is one point in the story's passage through time, one moment in the long journey of Oisín's voice from its original utterance to the present. The story arrived in the English-speaking world through translation, most significantly through the work of Standish O'Grady and later Lady Gregory, who translated and retold the Fenian material in forms accessible to readers who did not have Irish in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. W.B. Yeats wrote his early long poem, The Wanderings of Oisín, in 1889, drawing on the same tradition, bending it toward his own concerns, with age and artistic longing, and the difficulty of returning from visionary experience to ordinary life. The story has never stopped finding new voices to carry it, new forms to inhabit, new audiences to receive it. What persists across all of these, from the manuscript tradition of the medieval monasteries through the oral accounts preserved in Gaeltacht communities into the 20th century, through the literary treatments in Irish and English, through the various retellings that continue to appear, is the central image. A man who went to the place where time stopped, lived there for what felt like no time at all, and came back to find that the world he had left was centuries gone, and the particular quality of what he brought back, not youth, not the other world, not the ability to return, but memory, complete, undimmed, fully inhabitable memory of everything he had been and known and loved. Memory is what Oisín was, in the end. It is what the tradition needed him to be. The world of the Fianna had to go somewhere when it ended, and the place it went was into him, into the specific capacity of a man who had spent 300 years in a land where nothing faded, and whose memory had thereby become something different from an ordinary mortal memory. He could describe the color of Fion's cloak and the sound of Bran and Scialung, Fion's hounds, and the way a particular valley in Connacht looked at first light in winter, because those things had not dimmed in him, the way they dim in ordinary men who live through the years with their memories accumulating rust. He gave the tradition what the tradition needed, and the tradition in return gave him this. His voice is still here. The stories are still in circulation. The name Oisín, Oisín, little deer, fawn, the boy who came out of the deer herd on the slopes of Ben Bulben and became the greatest poet of his age, is still spoken. What he lost when Ember threw him into the grass of Ireland was everything that can be taken by time. What he kept was everything that cannot. The stone room and the monk and the candle are gone now in the ordinary way of things. The monk's hand, the candle's flame, the particular quality of light in that particular room in the monastery, all of it dissolved across the centuries into what the past is made of. But the vellum the monk wrote on, the careful close hand moving across its surface with the stylus, the words filling the columns one after another, that is still here, in the manuscripts, in the libraries where manuscripts are kept, in the scholarly traditions that attend to them, in the translations and retellings that carry the substance of the words into new languages and new forms. The Book of Lismore, a 15th century manuscript from County Cork, contains portions of the Acalamna Senorach, the colloquy of the ancients, the text in which the last survivors of the Fianna give their memories to the new order for preservation. The manuscript is kept now in Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, having traveled from the place it was made across 600 years of Irish and English history. The vellum is worn at the edges. The columns of text are dense and practiced, the hand of a copyist who was doing careful work. Every word in it is a word that went from Oisín's memory into speech, into manuscript, into survival, and the chain has not broken. Outside, wherever outside is, the hill the monastery stood on, or a hill like it, somewhere on the west coast of Ireland, where the Atlantic is still where it has always been. The ground is the same ground. The grass is the same wet grass. The stone is the same limestone. The light is the same changeable gray-white light that Oisín recognized when he came back across the sea on Embar's back and saw Ireland rising out of the horizon and felt something loosen in his chest that had been held close and quiet in the land where nothing loosens, where nothing moves toward endings, where the morning is always the same morning and the distance to the horizon is always the same distance. He wanted to come home. That is the simple human truth inside the mythological structure, and the tradition does not moralize about it. He had everything Tir na nOg offered, which was everything in the fullest possible sense, and somewhere inside the long undisturbed continuity of the other world, something in him turned toward the mortal world and its rain and its changing light and the specific impermanent faces of the people he had known there. The tradition does not present this as foolishness. It presents it as something the tradition recognizes, the pull of origin, the particular attachment of a creature to the conditions it was first formed in, the way a river finds its way back to the sea by routes it was not taught. The mountains of the Irish West are still there. Ben Bulben in County Sligo, where Fionn found a young boy standing among a herd of deer on the mountain's lower slopes and looked at the child and understood what he was looking at. That mountain is still there, still wearing its flat limestone top, like a long table set against the sky, its sides dropping away steeply to the green valley below, its particular outline unchanged across the 10,000 years since the glaciers left it in that shape. The same profile that Oisín would have known, the same outline that has held its position in the Irish sky through every version of the story that has ever been told, through every age of the island, through every change the country has undergone in all the centuries since a man named Oisín came back from the otherworld and lay down in the grass and opened his mouth and began to speak. The mountain does not need to know about the stories to go on being the shape it is.